Okay, so welcome everybody to this session. We're gonna make a prompt start. I think we've got sort of around about 10 people signed up to this session, but people may join us as we continue. But the joy is of the virtual setting is that we are recording. So if people aren't able to join us for whatever reason, then they can access the recording afterwards. It's really fantastic to see you here. I can see that somebody's joined from a car. The joy of virtual conferences means we can do that. We can have that facility. But so during this session, this is the third of our workshop sessions. Hopefully, you've been able to join others earlier on this morning. But we continue to explore our conference narrative and our conference theme of leading your evolution with purpose. So this particular session is all about personalized learning and technology, and is about the future of learning, and very much fitting in with our conference narrative, but not just was related to the pandemic and what we've learned during the pandemic about what our young people want from their education. And if you were able to join us earlier in the week, you'll have heard sessions where we really explored that. How well do we really know, and how much do we allow our young people to inform the purpose of education and the way that we do things in our schools. That's been one of our very strong conference themes, and not just young people, but also their parents and also the broader community. But I think one of the things that we've heard from our network over the last 12 months, and have definitely had reinforced and amplified during this week, is this notion that actually we are at a stage and at an age in our education system where we may need to think very carefully about the experiences that our young people have had during the pandemic, and at both ends of the spectrum, how those experiences of being able to personalize their learning experience from home has been hugely beneficial for some of our young people, whilst at the other end of the spectrum has not been beneficial at all. But I think what it does is it fires hopefully it fires a conversation amongst us as educators about how do we move away from this sort of one-size-fits-all presentation of education in our schooling system. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to welcome Jennifer Groff, who is the founder and CEO of Learning Futures. Jennifer is joining us from the United States, so it's quite a bit earlier there in the morning than it is for us. But Jennifer assures me that she has a very large cup of coffee, which is going to keep her powered through this session very early in the morning. I'm around to facilitate any discussion or conversation that happens, but without further ado, Jennifer, I'm going to hand over to you. And I'm really looking forward to this session. So without further ado, Jennifer, welcome to our conference. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to tell us.
Great, thanks so much, James. And really great to be here with you all this morning. It is early, but the sun is up and I am awake, so all good. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in the event. I've been able to attend some sessions and they've been really fantastic. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some ideas here with you today, but really mostly want it to be a conversation so that we can dialogue about what I'm presenting here. I think that's really what's most beneficial, is being able to tease and chew on them together. So as James noted, I do work under my own organization called Learning Futures, where I help schools navigate their future learning design and how they go into their forward journey into the future. And I also, this past year, was the Innovation Fellow at WISE, helping them set up their Innovation Hub, which is a network of schools doing this work, embedding innovation labs into their schools as mechanisms to drive forward their vision. So I'm going to walk through the scope of the session so that you can sort of see where we're going. And I'll spend a little time in the beginning talking about the future's landscape. So big picture zoom out of the whole ecosystem of education, where things are and where things might be headed, mostly because I think there's some important things to know about, but also to spur some thinking about that bigger zoomed out picture that we might not always take a look at. And then I'll bring it back down and look at what's happening today, what's practical and what's useful knowledge about what other schools are doing with personalized technology today. And then finally, I'll leave you with some strategies for future design for how you can get started in next steps. Or I have a sense that a lot of the schools participating in this event are already, quite forward-thinking schools. And so just additional strategies or approaches that you might consider in engaging some of this work. All right, so let's look at the future landscape. So Education has an interesting setup. As we well know, it's largely been set up for quite some time as a pipeline, right? K-12, we send them to sometimes higher ed, sometimes to vocational, but they ultimately end up in the workforce. And one of the challenges with this setup, as anyone doing innovation in education knows, especially K-12 education, is that higher ed really limits a lot of the innovation we can do because of the entrance exams. At least that's what I hear in many of the schools that I work with. That's one of the major concerns of how do we really replace exams and replace the traditional measures, because we need to still make sure that our kids get into higher ed. And then, you know, those diplomas of where they get out from college largely, you know, quote unquote, dictate where they go into the workforce. And so higher ed has really had, I'd say, a bit of a stranglehold on the system. And I'm making this point because I'm going to come back to it later on when we look at what shifts are happening in the world. And so, as I'm sure you're all well aware, there's been a massive shift in the last decade that's been happening globally of this movement from content to competencies. We've seen this in K-12, but I think what's really interesting is that we're seeing it much more broadly than K-12 now. We're seeing it in higher ed, but we're also largely very much seeing it in the workforce, and seeing that many industries, many major firms and businesses are saying skills and competencies are the new currency. And for good reason, because they want to understand who are the employees they're getting, who are the workers, what can they do, and getting much better at understanding the journey that individuals have even after they leave university and on through their career. And so headlines like this are becoming much more commonplace, where we're starting to see much more of a focus on these skills and competencies and how employers can track them over time. And you know, this comes for a good reason. Although disciplinary knowledge is important, it is largely these broader competencies and skills put to use in real world context that really drives the world today. It drives our lives, and it drives the workforce as well. And so really helping us think about how we navigate, you know, creating learners that can navigate the complexity of the world beyond just disciplinary knowledge, using these skills and competencies to be able to go out and tackle the complex world that we used to talk about they would inherit. And I would say it's fair to say it's already here. And so a lot of the work I do with schools, and I think the work being done by many schools globally, is this shift from the traditional educational model. In the US, you know, we typically call it college and career ready education, and moving much more to this competency-based, mastery-based model, which isn't necessarily the same as personalized learning. I'll talk about that in a second as well, but really also helping getting schools on that momentum journey, that redesign journey, so that they're enabled and empowered as more AI-enabled technology comes down the line, which in the next 12 or 20 years will be really significant. We're going to see a lot of major shifts in the field because of new technologies really ramping up, being able to support teaching and learning and mapping and understanding individual pathways much better. And so how do we help schools be that dynamic in that dynamic journey? And so the OECD, I'm sure you're aware, a couple of years ago released their new 2030 framework. I think it's really fantastic. As someone who works globally, so I don't just work in one country and one country's system and frameworks, to have something like this by the OECD, which involved 3 years of many researchers and 30 participating countries, is really outstanding, because it really is more of a meta analysis or meta look at what we should be navigating towards in the world. And to just draw some highlights in case you hadn't seen it before, if you notice in the compass model that they use, competencies are at the center, they're at the core of the curriculum, and they still of course value the disciplines, but noting that that needs to really be the driver. I love that well-being has been put on this diagram, which does not typically happen in competency frameworks and learning frameworks, which is fantastic. And I'm really glad to see that's been such a prominent theme from this past year. And then learner agency, to me, is everything. So if we're not empowering learners to take control of their learning and drive it themselves, we're really disempowering them for when they enter the world and have to do that, of course, without us. And so that to me is a major factor for the work. And then finally, of course, redesign assessment to really support this new model. And so to just call out some pressure forces on the system that we see happening. So in the US, you know, in other parts of the world, some parts of the world, I know not everywhere, I know not in the UK, but, you know, there's a major debt burden that we associate with advanced degrees now that less and less is paying off. And many employers say that they have to spend lots of time, often up to 6 months, sort of re-educating a recent graduate from university to be ordered and able to do the work that they've been hired to do, which is really incredible if you think about it. And this disconnect disconnect that's happening between university and the workforce is one of the major drivers that we're seeing a lot of innovation in this competency and skills is the new currency work. And then, of course, there's going to be dramatic shifts over the next 20 years in the workforce, in the labor needs, because of industry shifting so much, which will only expand because of AI-enabled technologies continuing to come online. And so how do we really make sure that everyone is skilled for the jobs that they want to shift to? And thinking about how we do that reskilling and the lifelong learning journey that people will embark on in all of the years in their workforce. So this leads us to some good design questions. How can we create more effective and flexible pathways to work placement so that I can develop my skills and competencies in many places to end up getting me to where I want to go? And how do we empower individuals to have more control over that journey, that it's not just in that pipeline, that they can develop their skills as best meets their needs and as best the world can offer to them, because now there is so many ways in which you can develop skills and competencies that are in many different venues, especially because of technology, and also then making more equitable pathways to those jobs. And the one I love for our work in K-12 is how do we make all learning count? So how does the internship the 16-year-old does or some other experience, how can we include that in the portfolio of who this person is? So in the US, there's a major initiative, although it started here, it's actually up to over 600 organizations now, and over 30% of those are outside the US. So although this work started here, it definitely has a global footprint at this point, and I think we'll see more and more shift in this direction. So you can see major organizations involved in this work, and it was set up by the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation to really help tackle some of these challenges. Because largely this comes down to a data and infrastructure challenge. How do we create the infrastructure so that we can support learners in taking control of their journey and building skills and competencies in many venues and tracking that over time? And they've been really doing some incredible work. I won't go into these in detail because they're pretty technical and nerdy, but just to note that there are many organizations working to solve this challenge and to create more of this network or ecosystem that results in some really useful tools for us, especially the learning and employment records, which are starting to really have quite an impact in K-12 education, which I'll talk about in a second. And so what does this really look like? So what they're working on is this ecosystem of allowing anyone to sort of track their skills and competency growth over time, which means a learner-owned skills profile, open data standards so that different platforms can talk to one another. Some of them are built on blockchain in order to do that we work off of badges, skills, and competencies, and at times micro-credentials, which have become quite popular, and making these skills pathways open. And what that results in is a much more flexible, modular, dynamic, responsive pathways to skills and job placement. Which means the learner will have a lot more flexibility and a lot more ownership and direction in their pathways. So a few things to note for K-12 education. Learning and employment records, I think, are one of the areas that will see a large impact down into K-12. Some of these shifts will take time, I think, before we see them happening in K-12. But learning and employment records are already starting to be used. There's a number of samples I'll show here. There's many more than I had time to show here, but this is a good one I like. And you can see it creates a profile of an individual that can track their education history, their employment history, assessments that they've taken, and any certifications and licenses. And we'll see this more and more. You see LinkedIn starting to build things like this to help employers. LearnX is a really nice one. I think they do a really nice job of visualizing the skills and competencies that a learner builds over time. And IMS Global, you may know, is a large organization, nonprofit, that has been trying for quite some time to rethink this data infrastructure of K-12 education so that we can have a much more fluid and interoperable way of helping track learner growth over time. And so IMS Global mostly had only been focused at K-12 for quite some time, and more recently is now making the shift of looking at how do we support the data tracking of learners and learning over an entire ecosystem and an entire lifetime through higher ed and career as well. And one of my favorite examples, this comes out of Florida, but by a really visionary organization that's trying to build basically the Internet of Education, if you know the analogy of the Internet of Things, which means anything, a device, a smart device anywhere can be collecting data, feeding into a stream that collects and informs my life. And so we can think about the same thing for education. This is just a nerdy graphic to show how they're thinking about the ways in which a learner might be able to do that in many ways that they're interacting with the outside world. And that includes things like, you know, time they spend on Khan Academy over to some training that they have done, or an internship, et cetera. And there's many others. I won't go into them all now. And so what's really interesting about this is it's really pushing on the pipeline model and really helping us to think about, what if it wasn't a pipeline? What if it was an ecosystem or a network that allows people to move more fluidly through that? And interestingly, in that way, higher ed, I think, is going to then be one of the most, you know, concerning areas of the pipeline and its future because of these changes. So before I go into the next session, bringing it back down to where things are today and some personalized learning technologies that schools are using, I wanted to just pause and ask if there are any comments or questions based on what I shared thus far.
Brilliant, thank you, Jennifer. So just on that first session and thinking about that, you know, futures landscape and that sort of, that's with the interconnectivity of things that influence on our young people and the career paths that they might follow. Has anybody got any sort of initial thoughts or comment or anything that's made you think about in your setting? And please just unmute yourself if you do. Okay, I've given that a good 30 seconds, so I think that's probably enough time for people to respond. But I appreciate you're taking on board a lot of information, and it might take you a while to sort of process some of that. So please do just jump in if a thought occurs to you as we go through the presentation. Thanks, Jennifer.
No problem. And yeah, of course, at the end, I'm happy to discuss further. But part of the reason I wanted to show some of that is because I think these are a broader landscape shifts that are already in process. And I think it'll be pretty clear how things like the learning and employment records connect really nicely to a lot of the digital tools that many schools are already using today to profile learners, to create tools that help track their journey in K-12 and help set them up for university. So before we jump into looking at that, I just want to get, you know, alignment on what we mean by personalized learning, because it is a broad term that does look a number of ways. And so I use the Aurora Institute definition. I think they're one of the best organizations that's really spearheading work in this space. And so they talk about it being the ability to tailor learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests, including enabling student voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn, to provide flexibility and supports to ensure the highest mastery of standards possible. So mastery being a key piece of that, and mastery competency sometimes used interchangeably. But the examples I'm going to show today are specifically talking about that competency-based version of personalized learning, because personalized learning can be thought of in a way that still largely looks at the traditional curriculum structures, the traditional disciplines, and that's fine. That's one version of personalized learning. And so competency-based is really much more also including those broader skills and competencies I talked about at the beginning. And I like this kind of diagram that they use to unpack all these terms for us. So the way I see learning technologies in this space is they kind of fall into two camps. One is the adaptive and skill-based technologies that largely support the traditional disciplines or knowledge building that we might think about in education. And these are really incredible tools that we should be leveraging, because they can really support some of the foundational literacies that kids need to be building, that AI, frankly, can at times do an even better job than whole group instruction, or even, you know, if you have the ability to do more small group or tutoring, which is hard because of human capital time in the classroom. You know, these tools collect data and track that data over time, which is humans do too. But why not leverage that so that it frees up teacher time to be doing the other things that this technology does not do well? So and then the second piece are the tools that allow us to manage these kinds of learning environments in a personalized system where we're tracking competency over time. How do you manage that? How do we, you know, do that kind of work? previously was the Chief Learning Officer at Lumiere Education, which is a network of very progressive schools where there's no set curriculum and every child has a very individualized journey. And we always used to get asked, how do you manage that? And the only way we could was through digital tools that help us manage that kind of complexity. And so I'll talk a bit about the tools that really I've been impressed by seeing schools use today to support that kind of education. And just to discern what I mean by these different types of tools and ways of thinking about it. This is a competency map from one of the schools we work with in Qatar called CAST. And they have a learner profile that breaks down these large buckets of competencies, broader skills and competencies that they're targeting. And then you can see at the bottom these language literacy, math literacy, science and digital literacy, data literacies, these foundational skills that sort of set the base for these broader competencies to be built on. And so I think you'll see more and more great AI-based tools that are hitting that bottom layer and enabling us to really build those literacies as a foundation so that more integrated project-based learning can support the development of those broader competencies. So I just wanted to call out one tool. There's many on the market that are really fantastic, and they all, of course, sort of operate differently. But one I've been really impressed by is Century Technologies. They have an adaptive AI-enabled platform that allows you to develop and track personalized learning journeys in English, math, and science, which I think is really incredible. And I really like their approach because they have an integrative team of both technologists that are really building cutting-edge technologies, but also learning scientists and educators who think about the pedagogy of that. So I just wanted to share that if you're looking for a resource or tool to support that more foundational literacy piece.
Jennifer, just to come in on that point. So if anybody's sort of interested in looking at the application of Century and Century Tech in the classroom, then one of the trusts in the whole education network has been working on that has been working with Century for some significant time. So if that's something that you'd like to sort of find a bit more detail about and get under the skin of a little bit more, then please do let me know, and I can connect you to both the school leaders, but also the trust leader of that group of schools based up in Wigan. So thank you, Jennifer. Yeah,
fantastic. That's excellent. Yeah, so, and like I said, there's a number on the market that you can look at to be supporting learners, but I've been really impressed by that one, in part because not many tools tackle all those domains in one platform. So now I want to turn to looking at tools that support the holistic profile or the competency growth of the learner. And this is a platform that is developed here in Philadelphia, where I'm currently based, by building in partnership with Building 21, which is now a network of schools here in the US. Have been really impressed by their journey. There's lots of videos you can check out that they publish about their journey. It's a set of educators that got together in early 2011, 12, I think, that, I think early days of the competency-based movement, and were really just keen to redesign how they thought about school. And today they are, to me, one of the best models of what competency-based personalized learning can look like, especially in a public system here in the US, which is really incredible. That doesn't always happen. Usually it's more private, independent schools that can do that work. But Slate is a platform, an open source LMS that they've developed in partnership with the school, and is run by a company called Jarvis. But if you have some really geeky folks at your school, which some of the schools I work with do, it's all on GitHub. You can download it and play with it yourself, customize it. The company that has built it, though, is really keen to continue to support more and more schools to move in this direction. And so I think they're really open to supporting schools cheaply or freely in a way that might not always be available by a company. And so what I really like about this platform is the way in which it allows the school to customize those competency maps that I kind of hinted to earlier by the school example I gave. I know it's tough to see on these screenshots, but on the left-hand side, you can see their listings of their competencies and how they break them out, which Building 21 makes all their competency maps free and open to use. So you can check those out if you're looking for good examples. But they allow, this platform more than most that I've seen allows you, it's built to kind of take in those competency maps that are unique to every school, right? So any school moving in this direction usually has to build their own, or they might make variations based on what they found on the internet. But I have a school in Doha that is using Schoology to do this work. They wanted to use Slate, but they couldn't get approval from their tech system. And so they're using Schoology, and Schoology does a good job, but it's not entirely built for mastery and competencies. And so I think they, like a number of companies, recognize that many schools are trying to go in this direction. So they're trying to catch up and accommodate, and they're willing to learn and work with you to make those adjustments. But that's different than a platform that has been built from the beginning to track that mastery over time and to see it in a dashboard format. The downside, of course, is that it's an open source LMS. It may not have all the whistles and bells that a platform like Schoology might have. But here you can see where a learner can log a learning experience or an artifact that they want to show as evidence of their growth. And the green lines show their sliders that allow you to, put input in on where they think their evidence is showing their growth on these mastery profiles in the sub-skills of engaging as a citizen. And then here's just the learner view so they can see their progress. These boxes, again, are these competency maps that allow you to see growth, and the numbers indicate where they are on that growth over time. And then the second tool I wanted to point out, because although I obviously, it's up to a school what tool they want to use, but I think there's not many examples that fill the need that MTC has. If you've heard of Mastery Transcript Consortium before, I've been really impressed by the work that they've done to solve this need of needing to build profiles of learners, schools moving in this direction. And then what do you do with all that data to get them into college? How do you turn that over to entrance exams, higher ed, to paint a picture of who they are? And so MTC is a nonprofit that got together and said, let's solve that problem together. Let's make it an open standard so that it's a unified profile. So that when universities receive these from more and more students, it's in a standardized format. So every school can have their own competency frameworks, their own way. If you see at the bottom of the screen here, it says transferable skills, and then you see the arts and health and physical education. This profile for this school maps all the traditional disciplinary knowledge that would be tracked in a traditional curriculum, but then it also has all of the competencies and skills that the school is targeting, and it allows you to build a profile for that learner in a standardized format so that when universities receive these, there's a standard template that they're kind of working off of, so it's not trying to dig through everyone's digital portfolio that's unique and distinct. And it allows you to show evidence. On the right-hand side, you can see artifacts that have been put in place by the learner or the school to demonstrate their growth in these competencies. And what I like about it is that not only is it standardized to make it easier for universities to be accepting this, but that it fundamentally takes the emphasis off of grades, that grades are not listed in this transcript. It shows growth on a continuum, which is really nice because, we know the challenges that grades have in the first place. But it's really putting the emphasis on the level of mastery and on demonstrating who this learner is. So this learner might have a lot of emphasis on internationalization and on language and writing, or another learner might have a large emphasis on science and technology. And so really painting that picture and making it easier for universities to deal with that. And last year, over 160 colleges had offered admissions to students who had submitted this way. So I hope that we'll see more and more movement in this direction in the years to come.
If I could just come in on that, Jennifer, because I think just sort of, I suppose, linking that to some of our conference themes, but actually some of the longer term themes that we experience across the whole education network and that, our schools reflect back to us. I think what strikes me about this is that, one of the things that our schools and our school leaders are really grappling with is that, they've got this whole education view of skills, qualities and knowledge. Obviously, we've got a real focus in the English education system on knowledge and how we measure that through examined outcomes, whether that's SATs or whether that's GCSE or A-level results. And one of the things that our schools have really grappled with in the last 12 months, and actually as a system we're grappling with, is actually how can we rethink and redefine assessment? And I think, what you're presenting to us here is both some tools that help us to really capture the competencies and the skills and qualities that we would like our schools to be about. And what I love about this is the fact that in doing so and in working, collaborating together, we can actually work towards a standard of those things, which is I think one of the things that lots of our schools grapple with. They'd like to spend more time on skills and qualities, but actually it's really difficult to do so and measure the impact that you're having in the same solid way that you can do with content and subject knowledge, you know, through our SATs examinations and GCSE. So I'll sort of make that point just for people to reflect on. If that is something that you've been grappling with in your school or your trust setting, then, you know, I think this demonstration that there are organizations out there that are prepared to work with you on how you grapple with that stuff, I think is really, really key.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to emphasize, it's a huge challenge that the whole field globally is facing right now. I think a lot of the work I do when I work with schools is that curriculum design to build those competency maps, which is everything. Getting those right is the key, because it's the ruler by which we measure growth, and you unpack that, and making them usable and actionable and coherent in your learning environment will be different for every school is the key. So that's a whole other talk for another day. But yeah, it's a really great point. My hope is that we will, in the next 5 or so years, you'll start to see more cohesion, more integration of these tools, and more alignment. I think the whole ecosystem is grappling with this right now. We're seeing a lot of great growth. There's many examples I could give of schools and systems moving in this direction, but we are still in that pain point time, to be fair. So just a couple other tools to note in case you're looking for some nice tools to do this holistic profile or competency growth mapping that I see a lot of schools using that are moving in this direction. Seesaw seems to be really popular. I mentioned Schoology before. Summit, of course, is fantastic, but Summit is a whole model in itself. It's my understanding is that you have to become a Summit school, whereas these other tools are just tools that allow you to map that. And Mahara is one I just learned recently is also open source, which is great. Okay, last section, and then I hope to get to some nice conversation. So just some quick notes about what do you do with this knowledge. So a couple of suggestions I have are just to, as best you can, keep an eye on that broader landscape, because things will be continuing to shift. And we'll also, I think, spur some ideas on how you can best support your learners. So knowing what's going on in higher ed of competency-based education is useful to know about, just because it's part of the ecosystem. Some great examples here in the US that I know of are Western Governors University and Southern New Hampshire University. Two universities are doing incredible work in building competency maps and competency development in university, and profiling, creating profiles of those learners for getting job placement. And so I think we'll see more and more of that happening in higher ed, probably less quickly than we'd like to see, unfortunately, but that's okay. There's other new pathways coming online though. So if you haven't heard of open classrooms yet, they're also my favorite example. I think they were early leader in this space, where they've done an incredible job of building open classes you can take on the internet and building those skills-based pathways to jobs. So they even have a guarantee, I think, that like if you want to be a graphic designer and you engage in their graphic design course pathway, if you don't have a job within like 6 months of completing that pathway work, there's some, you know, sort of reimbursement they have. But what I love about it is making that pathway clear. It's flexible in how the learner gets those credentials and maps that skill growth over time. And again, I think you'll see more examples of this. And I hope that we'll see some of that bleeding down into K-12, where kids can, you know, those who are ready for that kind of challenge, who want to go off in that direction, can go do that. And it's all integrated into a learner profile somewhere for them. I already mentioned the T3 network. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on. And the Innovation Hub at WISE is doing a lot of work on helping schools navigate to designing to these futures, how to start to integrate all these tools and towards this future pathway. And so we'll be publishing more and more free materials this summer that talk about our resources and our strategies and our findings that can support schools that want to move in this direction. And last couple of tips about vetting tools. You know, if you're looking for an adaptive learning tool, a couple of questions I recommend: in what ways is it personalized, and what are the implications for the student? So it might be a really great adaptive tool, but it, you know, it feels like grinding your teeth, you know, engaging with it. It's not fun. It's not, you know, motivating for the learners. And then how transparent are their learning objectives? What is this thing actually tracking? And what can you actually say about learner growth by their interaction with it? And how is proficiency determined, and at what depth of knowledge? So what is it actually telling you and giving you data on? And then finally, an important one I think we always should care about is this designed for universal design for learning? Meaning, is it designed in a way that all learners can engage with the digital tool? And then finally, looking at the other side of the landscape, those personalized learning technologies that map learner growth over time, just some good questions to look at are, first identify the learning experiences and the overall environment that you're looking to cultivate. Is it about the broader mastery that you're looking for, or student agency, that kind of thing? Define that both at the day-to-day experience of the learner and their overall time in your learning environment. What is the outcome that you're helping get them toward? And then from there, you can start to prototype and pilot and test a range of options to understand how you're supporting that. And we're a big advocate of that, prototyping, piloting, that kind of thing. And so what is the user's experience with it? Does it facilitate their agency and control of their learning? Is it able to accurately capture their learning and growth over time? And do these tools work together? Of course, you always have to care about that technical IT aspect of it being, coherent. And then rinse and repeat, meaning that, good future design is about this ongoing refinement of what is the experience of our learner? How are we giving them the data they need to make informed choices and to ultimately support their driving their learning over time? And then I'll just leave you with a couple of those innovation practices that we use. Think beyond the pipeline, like I said, create space for that kind of testing and innovation, testing new technologies, new ways of trying it. Let the kids drive that, let them pilot and test new ideas. As always, build through their eyes. So we use a lot of human-centered design, user-centered design, looking at the learner's experience and designing from there. And empowering people in your learning environment to be those innovators, to drive forward that design in an innovative way. So that's all I have prepared. If you want to get in touch with me, please don't hesitate to reach out over email or Twitter. And I thanks for your participation today.
Brilliant, Jennifer. Thank you very much. I think there's clearly an awful lot there, both in terms of the architecture, but also the practical software that can underpin it. But really interested to see if anybody's got some sort of initial thoughts or questions for you off the back of that presentation. Are you gonna, or KJ?
Yeah, sorry. And I appreciate, because I'm not, a head teacher from a school, but I work for a education charity. I'm quite interested in around school refusers. And sorry, is that feedback from mine, or can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, there's weird noise. Yeah, so I've been trying to think about young people who struggle in school, and I'm aware of there being quite a large group of young people who so basically they call them school refusers, and this idea of these sort of platforms as a mechanism for continuing to engage them in their learning, even if they can't kind of function within the formal education system. And are you aware of that happening anywhere?
It's a good point. Well, I'll say a couple of things. One, I actually lived in the UK a decade ago. I was a visiting researcher at Future Lab back when Future Lab existed. And one of the areas of work I was doing research on were schools that were set up to support those types of learners, or learners with high special needs that couldn't be supported in regular environments. It was some of the most innovative schools I had seen in my world travels. Why? Because we decided then it's okay to try new stuff. We can think outside the box because we're already not meeting them, which is really unfortunate. And I think that happens a lot because we're so afraid to take risks, or there's policies that straight up don't allow us to innovate and try new things. And so I've seen that very much in place in schools where we relax those restrictions and allow us to think very differently about what teaching and learning can look like. We see that here in the US and a lot of state policy now, thankfully, but of course we still have a long way to go. But the important point of this is that it's one of the many benefits of setting up an architecture like this. And a lot of, when I work with schools, even if they're not ready to go all competency based the way I'm sort of painting the picture of, I often advocate just get some of the tools in place, just get them there so that the kids can start to understand how to work with them and understand who am I as a learner, what's my profile I'm even looking to build, even if as a school you're not set up yet to do all of that. when you start to give them those tools and that control, they can start to drive, and they can start to see how they can be engaged, or, you know, they start to, it's not all black box so much for them. It's clearer on who am I becoming, what am I working towards, which the curriculum, the traditional curriculum that's not always the case, right? And so when you create those tools that allow that more clarity, and for them to document their learning and say, hey, I did this thing, can I put it in my profile? It creates a lot more flexibility to try new things, because you have a backbone that sort of collects that data.
And I think that's the thing that I think really interests me about this, because, you know, our whole education principles are about, you know, the second one is all about engaging learners and you know, developing through that engagement learner agency. And I think, you know, there's almost a chicken and egg situation in the question that you've asked, Emma, and the response that you've given, Jennifer, is that actually maybe we would have less school refusers if we had a competency-based sort of framework in place where we celebrated the broader set of skills that young people are developing.
Yeah.
So that actually they felt that their education, they were much more engaged in, because it isn't just about a narrow set of subject matter that they really struggle with and actually get fed up of going from lesson to lesson every single day to be told you can't do this, you know, to a broader set of, you know, a much greater celebration of the skills that they have got and the contribution that they can make, would be my first point. But actually, if we do this early enough, so if we, you know, if we take this approach with our younger children, then we create this self-determination amongst our young people around, you know, and give them real agency and control over, you know, we talk about assessment all of the time, but actually how often do we engage the young people in the assessment process? Now, how do you think you're doing? This is a framework and this is that criteria. How well do you think you're doing, you know, in your presentation skills or in your communication skills? You know, where would you place yourself on this competency framework? And again, in doing so, I think we would end up with less school refusers and less people, you know, because actually I'm more empowered and more in control of. So I think whilst the technology is shifting all of the time and it's still in many respects still in its infancy and in its emerging state, I think, you know, if we think about leading our evolution into the future with purpose, you know, what's the world that our children, the employability world that our children are going to exist in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time? And actually maybe, you know, arriving with a set of GCSE grades on a piece of A4 paper, you know, employers are going to turn around and go, actually, I'm not interested in that. Show me your competency map. That's what I'm really interested in. So yeah, I think it's a real chicken and egg in what you, but it's a really great point, Emma. Thank you for that. KJ, I mean, I'm really keen to come to you as well.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of building off what you were saying then. I really like the idea of the portfolio of careers. One of my whole school responsibilities is CIAG, careers and transitions. And our transition points currently are very heavily grade dependent. So the GCSEs, Key Stage 4 results, Key Stage 5 results. How, if American universities are using the competency portfolios that you just showed up on screen, how did they become mainstream? Was it a case of there was a critical mass of schools that started using it, and then the universities and what for us would be sixth form colleges or A-level providers just basically can't ignore it anymore? Or was there actually more of a push from either state level or, because I'm still not quite sure how it works in America, state level or countrywide level, that actually basically said, no guys, you've got to look at this as well as whatever qualifications they're coming with?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I witness is that it's in large part, you know, all the power is held at the higher ed level, at the university or college level, right? So what's been great though is for quite some time, especially in the US, but I see it globally. One of the major schools I work with is in Brussels, and we were just having this conversation where the universities that they're working with are also saying the same thing, where they're saying, actually, the entrance exams are not good enough. They're not painting enough of a picture of how we can decide who's a good fit. And actually, there's lots of research and data to support that those exams just don't do a good job of that. SAT was a lie, apparently. And so it's been really good to see it's been coming largely from universities starting to be open-minded about what that looks like. There has been pressure from state and school level here, but they just don't have a lot of clout at the university system. They hold all the power. So I think because it's a shifting landscape, which is super irritating for us, right? Because how do we design them? How do we plan? And it's such a mess because of it, unfortunately. And I was just talking with a colleague the other day about how do we bring this conversation to a larger stage so that we can make some movement here, because having grumblings and rumblings of like, yeah, it's not good enough, we want something different, is just not coherent enough. So I hope that gives hope that there are shifts happening and universities are asking for broader insights, but it's nowhere near coherent yet. So a lot of schools are banking by having this broader profile with traditional exams together.
And I think there are two. Sorry, KJ, I'll just add to that, because I'm sort of reflecting back on our annual conference last year, so back in January to 2020, and this was a really big theme, and I think there were two emerging pressures for the school system to respond to. One is higher education and universities and what universities want, but then the other one's employers and what employers want. And I think increasingly we're seeing, certainly in the global employment market, but not just in significant employers, where they're saying, actually, it's great that you've got those A levels and you've got that degree, but actually I've got 500 other applicants who've got the same A levels and the same degree. Actually, and so what we're seeing from the employment market are two things emerging: one, competencies, and the other one, values. So this notion of AI assessment of your values. You sit down in front of a computer screen and you answer some questions. And actually what they're interested in is, do you fit the values of our organization? Actually, because that's more important to us than the skill set you've got coming. So I think, it's a really interesting point about where is the critical mass. I think we can wait for the critical mass to happen, or I think we can sort of, in the way that some of the schools in the States have done, perhaps sort of seize the agenda and go, okay, well, let's push this a bit more. The other thing for the universities that makes me reflect on in this country is that, the very British approach to judging those competencies and values, which we will all know as sort of school leaders, we'll all know happens in the university interview. So all of these children have got the same predicted grades. And then, we throw all of these children into these perverse situations at universities where in 15, 20 minutes, with a recruitment officer in a university, they have to answer a series of questions which are going to demonstrate their competencies and values. Well, actually, that's fine if you're, an extrovert and you're pretty comfortable and confident about talking about yourself in that way. But what if you're not? And that's a really British approach to sort of separating out, young people who've all got the same A-level predictors. So actually, we really liked you. We didn't really like you. And I think a competency map is a much better way of making that assessment. But I think we need to push the universities on that. KJ, sorry, I cut across you when you were coming back in.
Yeah, no, actually, I was just going to say, so basically, if we're wanting to make that sort of systemic change, Jennifer, you'd suggest basically hitting the universities with it, because if they want it, then it's likely to, if those higher education institutions want it, then it's likely to filter down more so than us. Although it's useful for us, thinking back to the session last night where Tim was talking about the gaps in the hedges and all that sort of thing, and then there was a discussion of, well, what do we leave out? There's so much stuff we're doing. If we're going to do it, it's got to be something that's going to be beneficial and ultimately have a purpose. If it's just going to be a piece of paper a kid sticks in a wallet, and ultimately it was lovely at school, but is then not as useful for them, schools aren't going to have the time to do that.
Yeah,
which sounds quite cynical.
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think it's pragmatic, KJ. I think is the reality. But I think what I would say is, we've been talking as an education system, and certainly as a whole education network for a long time about, it's not just about the knowledge and the outcomes. It is about all of these other things. And I think actually there is a purpose and a value in doing it for that reason. We get better young people engagement. We get better agency amongst our young people. If it then ends up being something which is useful to universities and ends up being useful to employers in the future, great. But actually, let's do it now, because actually, do you know what? It makes our young people feel more valued in their education setting from a very early age. Then actually, that's a purpose in its own right, regardless of what it does from a career progression point of view. I think the other thing that I would say is, there's a lot of indication. Our universities are going to have to change in this country, because there's a lot of indication from the big global employers where they're turning around and going, actually, do you know what? Just come and work for us. Don't bother with the degree. We will give you the higher education training that you need, that's going to make you really good at this job. So I think universities are going to have to switch, and when that happens, so I can see that happening in the next decade. There are emerging points about it now. Then I think that will be hugely beneficial to you. But I would encourage you, if skills and qualities and knowledge, and we describe perhaps some of those things as competencies, are a passion for your school, and I think it is a passion for your school, then I think do it for that reason, regardless of whether there's any longer term benefit. I think the longer term benefit will come down the road. Awesome, Jennifer. Not many people in the session, but I think really fired the imagination of thinking of the people that were here, and obviously we've got the benefit of it being recorded. Jennifer, we have to end this session now, but I'm really pleased that you'll be coming back and talking to our trust leaders at our trust event in June. And I think just listening to this content has been really useful for me. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you about having that conversation with our trust leaders, because I think there's some stuff in there that they'll really enjoy as well. So thank you ever so much, Jennifer, for your inputs.
Thank you very much.
Emma and Joanne, thank you for listening. Others have already dropped away, but I hope everybody you've got a slightly extended break now, so it's a chance to run away, grab a sandwich.